The erased truth behind who really built New York City.
They said immigrants built New York. But what if the truth was buried under the very streets they walk on? This is Scope News.
Picture this: towering skyscrapers glittering against a cold Manhattan skyline, cab horns echoing through the night, and billboards flashing the faces of 1,000 dreams. Politicians love to call it a city built by immigrants. It's a phrase repeated so often, it sounds like gospel. But what if that story, so proudly wrapped in diversity slogans and campaign speeches, was only half true? What if beneath the story of Ellis Island and opportunity lies another foundation, one paved with forced labor, erasure, and a quiet exploitation of what it means to be Black? New York City didn't just rise from ambition. It was built, literally, on the backs of enslaved Africans who cut the timber, laid the bricks, and constructed the ports under the lash of Dutch and British overseers. When the Dutch established New Amsterdam in 1624, Black labor was already being imported to do the work white settlers refused to do. By 1703, over 40% of households in Manhattan held enslaved Africans. The irony? The same city that calls itself a melting pot of immigrants was once a major slave trading hub. Africans were sold at public auction blocks in Lower Manhattan. The docks they built were later used to ship more human beings into bondage. And yet, the official narrative shifts. Ask most Americans who built New York, and you'll hear that it was the Irish who dug its canals, the Italians who laid its bricks, the Jewish merchants who ran its shops, the Puerto Ricans and Dominicans who powered its factories. Those stories are true, but they start centuries after the first African hands had already built the bones of the city. The enslaved Black population wasn't just present, they were foundational, but you won't find their names on the plaques. You won't hear about them in the mayor's speeches. Because once slavery was outlawed, white and immigrant labor became the face of the American dream, and Black labor was erased from the story entirely. Today, that erasure continues, but in a new form. Recently, the city of New York elected Zohran Mamdani, a man born in Uganda to Indian parents, as its new mayor. In his victory speech, Mamdani declared this:
New York will remain a city of immigrants, a city built by immigrants, powered by immigrants, and as of tonight, led by an immigrant.
The words sounded poetic, but for many longtime New Yorkers, especially descendants of enslaved Africans, they felt like a slap in the face. Because to deny the role of enslaved Black Americans in building the city isn't just a historical mistake, it's theft. In the comments section beneath that very quote, the arguments erupted like wildfire. One commenter wrote proudly, "He's right. This city was built by immigrants, the Irish, the Italians, the Dominicans, the Puerto Ricans, the Chinese, the Jews. They came here with nothing and made New York what it is today." Their tone was triumphant, like history itself had just been settled in a single paragraph. But beneath that comment, another voice chimed in, quieter but sharper. Built by immigrants? So who laid the foundations before Ellis Island even existed? Who paved the streets you walk on before your grandparents ever got here? That digital debate, buried deep in a thread of political commentary, revealed a truth larger than any campaign slogan. During the 19th century, yes, massive waves of European immigrants, Irish, Italian, German, Polish, came to New York City, fueling its rapid industrial growth. They laid railroad tracks, built bridges, and worked in dangerous factories. And later, in the 20th century, new communities arrived from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, China, and South Asia, each contributing to the city's evolving identity and economy. Those contributions were real and essential. But what few acknowledge is that when those immigrants arrived, the city they entered was already standing. Its foundation, stone by stone, beam by beam, had been built 2 centuries earlier by people who were never called immigrants at all, but property. Dig deeper, and the story of Mayor Mamdani gets even murkier. According to a report from the Times of India, One commenter publicly called him a fraud, pointing out that his father allegedly utilized an African identity to gain a student visa to the United States. The claim is that Mamdani's father, though Indian by ancestry, leveraged his Ugandan birthplace to identify as African, taking advantage of special visa opportunities once designed to help displaced Black Africans and descendants of colonial oppression gain access to American education. The Times of India report draws comparisons to the 1960s programs that brought students like Barack Obama Sr. to U.S. universities, initiatives funded in part by American and African American institutions, hoping to uplift the next generation of African leaders. The implication? That some use that same social capital, the goodwill and resources originally meant for Black Africans, to advance communities that were not racially or culturally African at all. But it doesn't stop there. Allegations have surfaced that the current mayor himself may have leaned into this same African American identity when seeking access to elite spaces. Reports suggest that during his time applying to Columbia University, Mamdani identified under the broader African classification, an identity category historically tied to African Americans, to gain entry into one of America's most selective institutions. If true, it raises an uncomfortable question. How many doors have opened for individuals claiming proximity to Blackness, while actual Black descendants of slavery remain locked out of opportunity? Columbia University, once segregated and complicit in racial exclusion, now prides itself on diversity metrics that can be manipulated by anyone with a convenient birthplace. The irony is chilling. Centuries ago, Africans were enslaved to build this country. Now their identity itself is being repackaged as a pass to power. And here's the part that raised eyebrows. Mamdani reportedly didn't become a U.S. citizen until 2018. Yet by 2025, he's standing at the podium as the mayor of the largest city in America, promising $100 million in new aid to immigrants. That timeline has drawn criticism and suspicion. Because in the middle of a housing crisis, rising rent, and crumbling infrastructure, many native-born New Yorkers, especially working-class Black Americans, are asking, who is that money really for? For decades, New York has marketed itself as a sanctuary city, a place that protects undocumented immigrants from deportation and celebrates multiculturalism. But it's also become a place where non-citizens were nearly granted the right to vote. In 2021, the New York City Council passed a law allowing legal non-citizen residents, green card holders, and those with work authorization to vote in local elections. That law was struck down in 2025 by the state's highest court. But the attempt itself said a lot. Imagine, people who entered the country without full legal status being given the right to participate in the nation's most powerful city government. What other first world country allows that? The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, was originally written to guarantee citizenship to formerly enslaved Black people who had been denied recognition as Americans. It was meant to undo the horror of Dred Scott, to give legal personhood to those who had built the country with their bodies and blood. Yet today, the same law is used as a loophole, granting citizenship to the children of people who, in many cases, crossed the border illegally or overstayed visas. These anchor children, as critics call them, are born American, while the descendants of enslaved Africans continue to face systemic economic exclusion, generational poverty, and political neglect. The constitutional protection that was born from Black suffering has now been reinterpreted as an immigration convenience. And now, New York's leadership celebrates this system as progress. A city that once auctioned Black people as property now spends millions protecting new arrivals who have no ancestral, historical, or civic ties to its soil. The irony is haunting. The same voices that argue immigrants built New York ignore that before the Irish famine, before Italian ship workers, before Ellis Island even existed. Africans had already been here for over 200 years. Their unpaid labor built the streets that immigrants later walked on. Their forced sacrifice powered the ports where European ships docked. Their uncredited hands carved the stones that form the city's oldest architecture. The truth is, New York wasn't built by immigrants alone. It was built by Africans first, immigrants later, and by the exploitation of both along the way. What we're witnessing today is another version of that hierarchy, where the language of progress disguises an uncomfortable truth about who benefits and who gets buried in the footnotes of history. But perhaps the most haunting chapter is the one unfolding right now. Foundational Black Americans, the very descendants of those who built the city, are quietly vanishing from it. Census numbers tell a grim story. Once concentrated in neighborhoods like Harlem, Bed-Stuy, Queens, and the Bronx, their presence is shrinking year by year. In 2000, Black Americans made up nearly 30% of New York City's population. Today, that number has fallen below 20%, and it keeps slipping. Rising rent, gentrification, and immigration-driven displacement have pushed out the same people whose ancestors raised the skyline. In Harlem, brownstones once filled with generations of Black families are now owned by investment firms and rented out to tech workers from out of state. The culture that made New York, the jazz, the churches, the corner barbershops, the soul food spots, is being replaced by cafes and Airbnbs. It's a cruel twist of fate. The children of the enslaved built New York. Their grandchildren defined its sound, its style, its rhythm. And now, their great-grandchildren can no longer afford to live in the city their blood helped create. The same city that exploited them in life is now erasing them in memory. Picture that. The city that calls itself a melting pot, slowly boiling away the very people who lit its fire in the first place. And standing in the harbor, the Statue of Liberty still raises her torch, meant to symbolize freedom from bondage and the end of servitude. Yet the descendants of those who made that dream possible are being pushed out of the very land they freed. Few know that the abolitionists who helped design her wanted broken chains at her feet to represent the end of Black enslavement. But that truth was quietly simplified, reshaped into a softer image of liberty that erased the very people whose suffering inspired her creation. Even freedom itself in America was rewritten to make white comfort the hero of the story. Scope News tells the truth. Here are the facts. According to the Times of India, a commenter accused Zohran Mamdani of being a fraud, claiming his father used a Ugandan African identity to obtain a student visa meant for displaced Black Africans. Another commenter defended him, insisting that immigrants like the Irish, Italians, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Chinese, and Jews built New York City. Historical context, however, shows that while 19th and 20th century immigrants heavily contributed to the city's infrastructure and economy, enslaved Africans had already constructed its foundations 2 centuries earlier. Historical records confirm that programs in the 1960s funded African students, like Barack Obama Sr., to attend U.S. universities under similar aid. Additional reports have raised questions about whether Mamdani later used a similar African American designation to access Columbia University admissions programs aimed at racial diversity and representation, a claim Columbia has not publicly confirmed or denied. Research from the New York Historical Society and the Museum of the City of New York confirms that enslaved Africans made up 42% of Manhattan's population by 1703, and their forced labor constructed key early infrastructure. Later immigrant waves, Irish, 1840s, Italian, 1880s, Jewish, late 19th, early 20th century, and Caribbean 20th century, contributed to industrial and cultural expansion, but the enslaved African role predates them all. The 14th Amendment of 1868, born to protect freed slaves, now extends birthright citizenship to all children born on U.S. soil. Legal disclaimer. This Scope News report is for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. It references publicly available information and commentary protected under the Fair Use Doctrine for analysis and reporting. Scope News does not allege criminal conduct unless substantiated by verified legal documentation. Viewer discretion is advised.